There was once a young guy who was working on his speech to the girl he really liked. He wanted to tell her that he loved her and to know if she loved him back. So he practiced his speech, and when they were next together, he stumbled out his attempt as best he could. "I know I'm not as wealthy as Johnny Green," he said, "but I am a hard worker and I do care. And I know I'm not a great athlete like Johnny Green and I don't have a fancy car like he does, but I do love you. And what I want to know is, do you love me?" She thought about it for a moment and she said, "I do, but tell me more about this Johnny Green guy." What does it mean to say, "I love you," when you really care about someone? It seems that this is one of the bigger differences I've noticed between the generations here in our work at the Catholic Student Center. It seems that this younger generation, the so-called millennials, have made this ponderous thing, really, this huge moment in a relationship that's so different than the way we did it in my age. Perhaps we called it going steady at the time, and so it had a different flavor. But all I know is, when is it time to say it becomes this really huge dating challenge. Perhaps there's some awkwardness involved. Perhaps we're afraid it might sound so trite. It feels like such a vulnerable thing to do. We wonder if he or she will say it back. Perhaps we're afraid of looking like a fool. What if I muster all this courage and I pour my heart out because I think it's time, and the other person just kind of yawns? Some doubt if they really are capable of loving someone. We don't always feel it. What if I wake up tomorrow and I'm crabby and just feeling crabby at that particular person I just told the night before I love them? Plus there's this huge fear, I think, of saying, "I love you." I'm making a commitment. I'm making a commitment of some kind. And while perhaps somewhat exaggerated at this point in the relationship, in some ways I have to say to the millennials among us, perhaps you're dead on. Perhaps you got it right. That there really is something to that. And on some level, we really are making a commitment when we say it. As a young man, saying "I love you" to someone was something I rarely did. Oh, I could say "I love you too" if somebody else said it first. After they said it, of course. But I always felt sort of embarrassed to say it. It seemed just scary, like a really scary thing to say. And I have to say, quite frankly, that saying "I love you" was something I had to learn. I had to learn how to say those words. I remember the first time I ever said it to my dad, especially at the end of a somewhat tumultuous adolescence. It was awkward, but I got to tell you, my head didn't burst into flames. And I have to say, looking back on it, that it was one of the most important things I've ever said in my whole life. It was really, really important. You know, as humans, we just need to put it into words sometimes. We need to get it into words. We need to hear ourselves say it. The very expression "I love you," whether it's misunderstood or well received or rejected, the very expression matters. For the cost of not speaking it is that a piece of us dies. Consider how fish swim and birds fly. They do that because it's their very nature, to swim or to fly. That's what makes them fish. It's what makes them birds. Likewise, it is the speaking of our hearts that makes us human. It's the speaking of our hearts, no matter how it's received, that makes a human being human. And even if no one hears us, the very act of speaking frees up love to swim and to fly, to soar through this world. I think Jesus knew that. In this gospel story that's full of so many images, Jesus turns to Peter and he says to Peter, "Do you love me?" Now, Jesus is not asking that question because all of a sudden he's having this attack of insecurity around Peter and somehow he just needed to know himself whether or not Peter loved him. No, that wasn't what's going on here. What Jesus knew is that Peter needed to say it. Peter needed to hear himself say it. How about you? What would you say if Christ stood before you this morning and said to you, "Do you love me?" Could you ever say with Peter, "I love you, Jesus"? Do you ever tell it to God, "I love you, God"? When it comes to saying it, to actually saying "I love you" to God, most of us err on one side or the other. Some of us probably say those words way too easily, maybe a little too easily. "I do love you, but tell me more about Johnny Green." Perhaps we should be a little more hesitant because there is indeed a commitment required with those words. Maybe our young college adults got it right. This should make us balk a little. The words "I love you" have consequences. They have big consequences. Maybe not necessarily forever, but certainly in the moment, certainly here and now and tomorrow and the next day. That's why Jesus said to Peter after each statement of "I love you," and Peter mustered the courage to say it, even just assuming, "Jesus, you should know this. What the heck?" No, Jesus said, "I want to hear you say it. I want you to hear yourself say it." So after each statement, Jesus said to him, "Okay, Peter, you said I love you. Now feed my sheep." Those words have to show up in how you live, Peter. No wonder we might balk at saying it. While some say to God, "I love you," too quickly, I think there are at least as many, if not more, who just don't say it enough, if at all. And we miss the great intimacy that comes from the saying, the affection, the desire conjured up in the very statement, "I love you," that those words afford us. How about you? When was the last time you said to Jesus, even when you were praying, just the two? Maybe we balk because it sounds awkward, it sounds so trite. Maybe we're almost embarrassed to hear ourselves say it. Perhaps that's especially true for us men. Perhaps we're not confident that we'll live it out even tomorrow. Maybe the intimacy feels too vulnerable, awkward. It is intimate, but that's what makes it so important to say. We can do it, and we can get better at it. The truth is that while maybe some of us would balk, it is absolutely essential to say those words to our God. And if at least not to God, then to his Jesus, this very human face of God. lived among us, at least to him. One of the beautiful things about this morning is that you're here. You guys are here. Because I believe with all my heart that your choice to come to Mass this morning is a way of saying, I love you, God. I love you. And as a matter of fact, it would be good for us to name that that is what we are saying when we choose to come here. Jesus, I'm here because I love you. The Mass today is for me to say, I love you. Lizzie and Andy, what you are saying today by bringing your little Hattie to baptism, it's what your parents said that when they brought each of you to your baptism. Lizzie, I was there for yours. I did it. I'm so old. But what they said when they brought you, Andy, and you, Lizzie, to your churches in those days, what they said what you are saying when you bring your little Hattie to this baptism is you are immersing her in a community of good people seeking to live his way in the world, who are seeking to figure out what it means to say, I love you, Jesus, and to hear it from him too. And please, God, she'll grow up in the community of faith and hear it again and again as she's growing up. I love you, Hattie. I love you, Hattie. I love you, Hattie. I love you. And then someday the question will turn in her age. And he will say to her, Hattie, do you love me? And it will be perhaps her turn to balk and to swallow hard and to say, I hope, please God, with all her heart, of course, I love you, my Lord. I love you. And who knows, my friends, getting better at saying this to Jesus means we might just get better at saying it to each other, to the people we love. Or maybe, if we got better at saying it at home, we wouldn't be so scared to say it to God. My friends, today as you come to communion, even if you come just for a blessing, I invite you in the quiet of your heart just to say, I love you, to God. And if you're not all the way confident of yourself and your commitment, then maybe you could say, I love you enough to at least give you this moment of my day. For it is okay, even with doubts, raging, and balking and awkwardness, to put it into words. And maybe we even feel apologetic in the saying because we know of all the times we don't live up to it. We haven't done it well. And we're absolutely sure we're not going to do it perfectly in the future. But you know, it's still important to say. Do you love me? Jesus asked Peter. It's an important question. Today, this morning, he stands before you and before me, and he asks us each, do you love me? He waits to hear.